You're listening to the Ancient Aliens Debunked podcast. Hey, welcome to the Ancient Aliens Debunked podcast. My name is Chris White, the filmmaker of Ancient Aliens Debunked, available for free at the website ancientaliensdebunked.com. In this episode, I'm going to do something a little different. Instead of just talking about the recent blog post, I'm actually going to read a recent blog post. It's a pretty lengthy blog, and there are a lot of details that may be easier to understand if you saw the blog post, but I know that many of you just listened to the podcast, and so I wanted to get the information in an MP3 format for you as well. So this one is called The Age of the Sphinx, Colin Reeder versus Robert Schoch. Water erosion. It was posted on November 29th, 2012 by me, and it reads like this. I basically grew up believing the theory proposed by Robert Schoch and John Anthony West in 1992 that the Sphinx was eroded by water, and, as the story goes, the only time that could have happened was about 5,000 to 7,000 BC, which is of course far earlier than the conventional date for the construction of the Sphinx during the reign of the pharaoh Khafra, circa 2558 to 2532 BC. Schoch's early date for the Sphinx has been subsequently used by folks like Graham Hancock to support his theory of the existence of ancient civilizations like Atlantis. Others have noted Schoch's work to promote the theory of a prehistoric alien visitation and similar ideas. I think such theories are unnecessary in light of the evidence that I will present in this article. Unlike similar debates with ancient alien implications, this one has played out in scholarly circles, most of the articles being published in the late 1990s and early 2000s. For a very thorough, unbiased cataloging of this scholarly debate, I would recommend this series of posts from David P. Billington's website. One of the first things I think is important for anyone that believes Schoch's model to understand is that this debate is not really about the Sphinx itself, but rather it is mostly about the western side of the enclosure wall in which the Sphinx sits. If you do an image search for water erosion Sphinx or a similar phrase, you will not typically see close-up pictures of the Sphinx itself. Instead, you will see a lot of pictures of the western enclosure wall. Colin Reeder, a British geologist who was inspired by Schoch's claims, did a study of his own, which he concluded that the water erosion that was noted by Schoch is not evenly distributed at the site, and he concluded that the western enclosure wall was not eroded by rainfall per se, but rather rainfall runoff, which is explained below. Rainfall runoff would explain the extreme water erosion on the western side of the enclosure, and why the same characteristics could not be found either on the other enclosure walls or on the Sphinx itself. The Giza Plateau has an eastward-sloping topography, which causes a natural rainwater runoff into the west part of the Sphinx enclosure, which would erode the limestone along the exposed western enclosure walls and selectively exploit any joints exposed along the cut face. This view is contrasted with Schoch's initial assertion, which stressed that direct rain was the cause of the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure, not rain runoff such as Reeder proposed. Reeder's theory was met with more enthusiasm than Schoch's by mainstream Egyptologists, who by this time had realized that they too had better come up with a theory on this anomalous weathering on the enclosure wall. But there was a problem with Reeder's theory as far as they saw it. If Reeder was right, it would mean that the Sphinx was about 400 years older than they thought. And even though Reeder's date was 3,000 to 5,000 years after Schoch's, it was still not something that they were excited about agreeing to, though at present they've settled on a type of stalemate, calling Reeder's theory possible but not proven. The reasons that Colin Reeder proposed that Khafra didn't build the Sphinx often were the same ones that Schoch was using, with a few notable differences. Primarily because if the erosion was caused by the water drainage coming into the enclosure, then the Sphinx would have had to have been built before the quarries which lay to the west. This is because the natural path that the water would have taken on the way to the western enclosure wall would have been forever interrupted when the large quarries were made. In addition, Reeder proposes that the Sphinx was carved by an early solar cult on the plateau, which is why the Sphinx is facing toward the rising sun. He also proposes that it likely once had the head of a lion and not a man, but that the head was carved down to look like the head of Khafra during the time that the Sphinx was integrated into Khafra's memorial complex, which may explain the current disproportionately small head in relation to the bigger body. It seems that Schoch is also endorsing this lion view on his website. In many ways, this debate comes down to rainfall, when it was happening at Giza, and how much of it was there. As I've already stated, Schoch's model emphasized that rainfall, not rainfall runoff, was responsible for the deep erosion on the western enclosure wall, and therefore Schoch needs a lot of rainfall and a lot of time to make his theory workable. Whereas Reeder's theory, since it proposes that the collected water from the plateau gathered together and drained at the western enclosure wall, he needs a substantially less amount of rainfall and time to account for the erosion of the limestone wall. So let's talk about rain. Despite what a lot of websites and documentaries that talk about Schoch's theory try to make you believe, the increased period of rainfall that Schoch always cites did not just end abruptly 10,000 years ago. I will quote from Reeder's article, published in the Journal of Archaeometry, called A Geomorphological Study of the Giza Necropolis with Implications for the Development of the Site. He says, quote, "The rainy conditions of circa 5,000 to 7,000 BC, to which Schoch attributed the degradation of the Sphinx, will have been separated from these latter arid conditions by a transitional phase, during which increasingly arid conditions will have been interrupted by occasional, probably seasonal rains. Flood damage to Menkaura's Valley Temple, Reisner 1931, he's citing their paper, attests to that fact. Even during the late Old Kingdom, rainfall runoff was a significant agent of erosion at Giza." In other words, there is more than enough rain to cause the erosion during the time that Reeder is proposing for the Sphinx, especially when you consider that Reeder's theory needs only a tiny fraction of the rainfall that Schoch's theory needs. But again, this transitional period between 7000 BC and 2350 BC had plenty of rain, and even short bursts of rain which would cause a kind of flash flooding that could cause very quick erosion. Reeder cites other examples of this on the Giza Plateau in the excerpt above. Though Schoch has not written anything new in the scholarly journals about this, he did briefly interact with Reeder's points in a point-counterpoint which I have put together, and I will post it at the end of this article. Also, in an interesting twist, in a June 2005 interview, Schoch endorses Reeder's theory about the water runoff and the quarries, but says that he doesn't think that even with runoff being the primary agent of erosion, it would be enough water to cause the erosion seen on the western enclosure wall, obviously implying that he still thinks it needs the increased rainfall of his much earlier period. Though his reasons for this belief are not clear, he offered that though he agrees that the limestone is of poor quality on the wall, suggesting that it could be eroded easily, it is not as bad as some writers suggest. As far as I am aware, Schoch has never interacted with Reeder's responses to his criticisms, which are listed below, nor has he explained why he thinks the limestone rocks would need more time and more water than what were there during Reeder's earlier date. He does, however, make points regarding the context of the site and his own subsurface findings, which are discussed at length below. To be sure, there are other types of erosion besides water runoff going on at the Sphinx enclosure and on the Sphinx itself, but almost all parties agree more or less on the basics of these other types of erosion these days, even the mainstream guys. The Sphinx is made up of 3 different types of limestone, each with a different strength. The top and the bottom parts are much stronger than the middle part, which makes up most of the body of the Sphinx, and it is badly eroded by a number of factors. As I said, almost all parties agree, including Schoch and Reeder, that the erosion seen on the Sphinx itself is caused by a number of factors, including rainfall, not runoff. Even the conventional date for the Sphinx allows for a couple hundred years of light rainfall. In addition, all parties now agree that salt exfoliation, or chemical weathering, proposed by K.L.A.L. Gauri, is also playing, and has played in the past, a major role in the erosion of the Sphinx. Here is a description from Colin Reeder about this process, which can and does happen even in the desert conditions today. Quote, dew forming at night on the exposed limestone removes soluble salts from the surface of the rock. Capillary forces draw in this solution into the pores of the limestone matrix, where further salts are dissolved from the internal pore walls. As daytime temperatures rise, the solution begins to evaporate, precipitating salt crystals within the confined neck of the pores. The pressure which the crystals exert as they grow leads to the flaking of thin rock layers from the surface of the limestone. Schoch has another line of evidence which centers on what Schoch believes to be subsurface weathering of the floor of the Sphinx enclosure. He attained this data from non-invasive seismic geophysical surveys. This part is a bit technical for me, but it was explained to me this way by someone involved in this debate who wished to remain anonymous. Quote, what Schoch tried to do was date the exposure of the enclosure floor to dry air weathering. When rock is exposed to the atmosphere, it begins to undergo chemical changes, and the depth of this change or weathering can be a measure of how long the rock has been exposed. What Schoch did was measure the depth of the weathered rock using sound waves. These bounce back very fast if the rock is sound and more slowly if it has been weathered. He found that the rock under the floor, along the sides and front of the monument, had weathering that was twice as deep as the rock under the passage and back of the monument. From these findings, he concluded that if the back passage was excavated by Khafra, then the main body of the Sphinx would have stood on an exposed floor beginning sometime between 4750 BC and 7000 BC. It's debunked, available for free at the website ancientaliensdebunked.com. In this episode, I'm going to do something a little different. Instead of just talking about the recent blog post, I'm actually going to read a recent blog post. It's a pretty lengthy blog, and there are a lot of details that may be easier to understand. Posted on November 29th, 2012 by me, and it reads like this. I basically grew up believing the theory proposed by Robert Schoch and John Anthony West in 1992 that the Sphinx was eroded by water, and, as the story goes, the only time that could have happened was about 5 Dan if you saw the blog post, but I know that many of you just listened to the podcast, and so I wanted to get the information in an MP3 format for you as well. So this one is called The Age of the Sphinx, Colin Reeder versus Robert Schoch, Water Erosion. It was You're listening to the Ancient Aliens Debunked podcast. Hey, welcome to the Ancient Aliens Debunked podcast. My name is Chris White, the filmmaker of Ancient Alien 1000 to 7000 BC, which is, of course, far earlier than the conventional date for the construction of the Sphinx during the reign of the pharaoh Khafra, circa 2558 to 2532 BC. Schoch's early date for the Sphinx has been